This is Game Studies India Adda.
So, hello and welcome everyone to our bi-weekly Game Studies India Adda podcast series. I am really happy to say today we have with us Dhruv Jani of Studio Oleomingus, whose modest self-description of being a small independent game and art studio in India gives a lie to how it has taken the Indian gaming community and the world by storm. Studio Oleomingus also won the Humble New Talent Award at Amaze Berlin 2020, a fact that we are very proud of and restate our heartiest congratulations for. We here at Game Studies India,
Thank you.
a consortium of game studies scholars and games enthusiasts, have been fortunate to have previously hosted talks on Oleomingus's games. And we are really happy to have Dhruv here with us for our podcast today. I'm Shovik and have with me today Orithro, a fellow member of Game Studies India, and we are excited to finally have a chat with the author of the game.
Welcome.
So a hearty welcome to you, Dhruv.
Oh, thank you. That's a really generous welcome. Thanks so much. It's lovely to be here. I was, introduced to this collective of game studies only a while ago, but it seems like very exciting, and it's beautiful to see such a gathering of folks talking about games in the country.
Thank you, Dhruv. So, Dhruv, in this podcast series we are conducting, we are very much interested in learning about our guests' first experiences of gaming. So, let's begin with that, shall we? Can you please tell us a bit about the first games you have played? How did you grow up with the games, and how did your game thinking evolve?
Yeah. So my association with games has been rather sporadic, but it definitely began with a lot of board games, and we as a family continue to be avid board game players even today. So I started with a lot of playing a lot of Clue and Scotland Yard and Scrutinize, games like that. Eventually, sort of completed Catan and Carcassonne and so on. But it was definitely more analog games than video games, at least in the beginning. And then at some point, I guess I still saw video games being played more than played them myself. So my cousins had a computer. This is in early 1990s, I think, 1994, 95, something like that. And they would play Prince of Persia and a couple of other textures. I'd be content to watch them play those games. I found them fascinating, but was never really tempted to play them so much as simply view the games. I only really started playing video games in early 2000s when my father's office started to computerize. He started to shift to pretty powerful computers to run CAD software in, and then and those computers could run video games. I spent a lot of time coaxing those computers to run pirated copies of Hitman and and Unreal Tournament, stuff like that. But more as technical experiments, to see if those computers I could get those computers to run those games or not. And sort of mess around with all the keygen and crack software that went along with trying to run a pirated game. I mean, I think that is how I sort of started sporadically playing games here or there. But it wasn't until I was in college that I really started playing video games, or at least found video games that I would enjoy playing for protracted periods of time, which is when I got into RPGs and certain story-driven games. I played a lot of Oblivion and Neverwinter Nights, and a little bit later, Dragon Age and Mass Effect and the whole BioWare canon of games, and sort of at the same started to see some very exciting sort of games by, source mods by Dan Pinchbeck and the stuff by Robert Yang and Blender games, and these very strange esoteric games, what we now call indies. So I think that is when I really started to spend serious amount of time playing video games and sort of pottering around their worlds, thinking about them, I guess.
So, amongst all of these games that you were talking about, are there some of your own favorites, or some game or some genre that you love playing over than other?
The first time I started playing, what are derisively called walking simulators now, I sort of fell in love with just the act of simple movement, and sort of uncomfortable narratives unfolding alongside just the act of walking. I mean, DRS was definitely one game that I kept returning to over and over again.
Yeah.
That I loved, and the older, version, the source mod itself was remarkable, and the new one was, of course, visually splendid as well. And I mean that is and that sort of a play style sort of bled into how I started playing larger games as well, and games had become large enough by then that you could do random stuff within the game without breaking it. So Skyrim, I've spent about 100 hours sort of roaming Skyrim without having to bother with the actual narrative, which is quite a tedious bore, but but the rest of the game is beautiful. And it's such a pleasure just sort of wandering the game world. So I think I ended up spending more time in gamers than in the games themselves, especially how I ended up playing them, at least over the past past decade or so.
That's really nice to hear, Dhruv. I was actually wondering about something you said just now, that you were fascinated by the fact that you could wander through these game worlds, right? So the concept of space then becomes very important for you, does it not, for the games? Because as we play video games, we have often wandered through the places, and we have often been fascinated by the spaces that we move through, out and inside. So what would you say about this spatiality that you seem to pay attention to in your games?
So I have had a changing and somewhat uncomfortable relationship with what I like to think of as video game spaces. Often when I find video game spaces getting into material spaces, and the other way around as well. So I studied exhibition design, so I've never really practiced as such, and a lot of my work and study was centered around the study of spaces and architecture, especially temporary constructions, and in that they were not dissimilar to how first-person video game spaces are constructed and deconstructed as you sort of move through them. But even though I enjoy the idea of expansive video game spaces and the ability to move through them, I'm also cautious about how players sort of move through these spaces, and what does that mean to our conception of space, especially because video game spaces are particularly bereft of imprints of labor or economies that get to create spaces. So you end with fantastical structures all the time, and video game player bodies in response to such fantastical spaces, sort of become more and more masculine and more vigorous and overwhelming, and I find that distortion very uncomfortable, especially in sort of games that are very, very centered around a strong hero's narrative and tend to be open world, magnanimous in their architecture. But at the same time, there are very clever, smaller video game space oriented experiments that I rather enjoy. So I think there's much work to be done, but there is a very interesting vocabulary buried somewhere in the relationship between how we move through virtual spaces.
So I think maybe this is what inspired you to become a developer yourself. When what happened? What was your inspiration behind becoming a developer yourself, and what was your first time experience making a game?
This is I was so my final year project, in fact, a couple of my final projects, towards the end of my tenure at college, centered around virtual spaces in some form or the other. Usually they were parametric architecture spaces, or they were speculative spaces built into the old Namtaba. And they were not traditional video game projects, but I had to start using video game adjacent tools to build them and visualize them. At which point it just sort of naturally bled into trying to make something a little bit more coherent and less driven by static images. Something that you walk around and look at. And so some of my first very, very crude, very experiments are all first person video games, or first person video game like things that you can move around in. But it wasn't until a residency sort of program at college in Delhi, sort of gave me space to think about it, that I started to seriously wonder about the possibilities of telling stories in these spaces. And since then, I have all but ignored the social aspect of video games in favor of trying to figure out, what narratives are doing to them.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's actually very interesting how you're using spaces of. I mean, what actually was then your focus only on focusing on spaces in games, or also the narrative as two different things, or sometimes coalitioning them? How do you now view as spaces in games as opposed, or as in contrast or in similarity with the narratives that the games tell?
I usually, unless the game is trying to do something fundamentally different with the space or how you move through it or interact with it, and there are quite a few, small to mid-sized games that do this. But for most traditional games, I tend to look at spaces as corridors, if you will, a display corridor, which, if I were to follow its rules and its arcane, pathways, will yield meaning at the end of the product movement. So they're simply engines that guide player movement in very specific ways. When movement is tied to the act of trying to make meaning of the narrative, and the narrative cannot exist without the player deciding to engage or to move through these spaces. So they do tend to be intimately linked together, but they are rarely written as such. And you can see that different in most sort of modern video games. You do have people working on the landscape, and you do see a certain layer of separation between the landscape and the story that is being told to the player, the story that the landscape is telling, and the story that the construction of the landscape, player's interaction with the landscape is telling. But of course, there are sort of wonderful exceptions to this kind of delineation between landscape and narrative. And I do like to think that it might be presumptuous, but we try to practice somewhere in between, where we mitigate the role of movement and landscapes so that you move very little in our games, and then we allow sort of storytelling to sort of lead into why you are in a particular place, or what you possess as a result of what you can see in that particular space.
This is really very interesting, Dhruv. And I was also wondering about what you just said about storytelling, right? So how important it becomes then for us to think about or the alternative for spaces that might be possible for storytelling, right?
Yeah.
I was also thinking that recently when I was replaying some of your games again, and I kept thinking about
Mhm.
how different they are from the experiences of playing something like, say, Europa Universalis, right? So
Yeah.
from where you could simply just play a grand strategy game as the Marathas and then hope to take over Europe, a sort of a post-colonial
Mhm.
recovery of sorts. How different is the
Yeah.
experience of playing your games, which promise a very different sort of post-colonial recovery, or probably the inability to recover from that experience, or then
Mhm.
to continue or start over in new ways, right? So I
Yeah.
kept wondering how important would you say how important would you say the very aspect of post-coloniality has been to your experience as a game designer?
So again, post-colonial studies and ideas are something that we stumbled into, just as we stumbled into the process of making video games. And we have, and the good thing about our process is that we're bad at both. We're very bad at comprehending post-colonial concerns in the larger sphere of video games, and bad at building them. But as long as we remain sort of conscious of certain fundamental privileges, both on behalf of the player and as creators, when talking about certain very specific stories and often very local stories. Um, certain certain concerns of gender, of place, of citizenship, of territories, they sort of automatically bleed into the work. And the traditional representations of these aspects of an identity, especially in video games, even in video games that allow sort of counter-colonial narratives, or eventually you can go and conquer Europe in some cases, even in video games that allow this. As long as we sort of remain while working on our own games, as long as we remain aware of the fundamental failings of being able to represent power hierarchies inside games, I think we usually end up with interesting stories. And as you pointed out, they tend to differ from the traditional exuberant mode of reclaiming the past, or of returning to a past, or formulating or reimagining it, by questioning whether it is possible to do so or not, or who gets to decide whether it is possible to do so or not, and who gets to embody and play through it. And I think the negotiations between those decisions about who gets to belong where and tell what story tend to interest us more than the telling of the story itself, or the recounting of a particular history itself. And the further back dig into specific periods in time, the more intricate these negotiations become, between how something is recorded and who recorded it, and how it is retrieved by us and readapted and repurposed to multiple narratives. I don't know if that answers your question. That was a bit meandering, but
No, I also kept thinking about how, while listening to you, I also kept thinking about how even the way in which you were answering the questions, they sort of tend to sort of parallel the ways in which one plays your games, right? So many of my experiences of playing your games are very meandering in nature, and that also makes me think about the way in which we tend to look at history, or the way in which we tend to look at literature, right? We try to follow a linear narrative. We try to sort of follow the proper cues, say, of storytelling, that B happens after A, and C happens after B, and so A to B to C. So but we never tend to think about why is it only A to B to C, why not the other way around? And if it was the other way around, then what kind of a world would it have been, right? So that's the experience which I usually have while meandering through your games, and that is why I think, even for us, for example, say, Orithro and I are both literary scholars. So for us, the very aspect of storytelling and narrative becomes very important, which is why we especially enjoy playing your games, because of the
yeah.
very different types of gaming experience that it gives to us, as opposed to say the example which I was just talking about, Europa Universalis, right? And it is here that I sort of think about what becomes so very important to me when I'm playing your games is this elusive aspect, this elusive question of the origin, right? Because when I'm playing the games in somewhere, for example, the very title of somewhere itself is sort of promising an origin while at the same time deferring it, right? So I wanted to ask you, what do
Yeah.
you think about origins when you are making your games?
So you're quite right to mention the sort of meandering, wandering quality of of negotiating our narratives, and a lot of that is. I'm glad that it comes through, um, and it is deeply influenced by situationist and to a certain extent Dada writing, and a whole bunch of nonsense literature that also takes this path of where stories come from and where origins and beginnings happen, and what a beginning means to a story anyways. Especially, and it becomes particularly pointed the moment you start to delineate between colonial and anti-colonial narratives, or subaltern narratives, or narratives told from slightly older points of view than the ones that are traditionally recorded or popularly recorded. And then the question of who is telling the story becomes a little bit more important than merely where the story begins, because often the story is allowed to somewhere, depending on who gets to tell the story. So origins of stories especially, but origins in general, origin countries, identities, boundaries, are fascinating to us, and we try to poke holes in where things come from, often using base forms of ridicule, adding surreal touches to it, or like telephones in one of our games, and the active material and informational movement across borders. Or language itself, languages being invented, words, cities, people. But most of all, we are sort of interested in inventing authors, authors who can tell the story on behalf, and authors who themselves are appropriated by other authors and by other authors in turn, until it becomes very hard to delineate precisely where the story might have originated, and what part of the story is actually original, and what is merely appropriated from other sources.
Right, right. That's really informative. I also wanted to ask you about some of the games of somewhere which I've been
Mhm.
playing for a while now and which I've been returning to again and again. So this one is about one of my most favorite games in somewhere, that is in the Museum of Dubious Splendors, right?
Oh yeah.
And yes, and I also had the good fortune to deliver a talk on it some weeks back, and I was talking about
Yeah.
colonial and post-colonial museums and the way of and the experience of playing such a
Mhm.
museological game. I especially wanted to ask you about something which I noticed while meandering throughout the museum, that there were certain doors in the museum that were boarded up, certain doors, certain rooms that you couldn't go into. And I kept thinking about how,
Mhm.
again, this very elusive aspect of certain histories which you can't fully get at, certain histories which are always incomplete. And I kept thinking about
Yeah.
what are these boarded doors doing in this museum? What lies beyond? And so I
Mhm.
always wanted to ask you that, why those boarded doors?
So you did you sort of touched upon the answer there. They definitely promise an expanse to the museum that does not actually exist. It is both the conceit of a video game, and video game spaces do this all the time, but also a conceit of museums. Right? So each museum gallery is merely meant to indicate at history, but each museum gallery also tries to be as complete as possible in the history that it is trying to tell you. So there's, it always seems to exist in this paradoxical tension of how much it can get away with displaying, and also how little it can get away with displaying, because displaying things is both expensive and tedious. So museums always seem to promise an expanse to history that is not merely contained within its walls or even within its collection, collections, or at least archives, which you'll never get to see in that museum itself. And I was trying to do a little bit of that. Boarded up doors and with sort of a couple of empty spaces in the middle of the museum where there are no exhibits, but you get a choice of doors. But also because the museum is somewhat non-linear, and you do have a choice of doors at points. The possibility of a boarded up door being a choice but not an explicit choice seemed interesting and also mischievous. And the player cannot really choose to go through that door because it's not really a door, it's a wall. But it appears to be a door, so it might have been a choice for somebody, maybe not the player now, but somebody in the past when the door was open. The museum was not so dilapidated that it does not even have a ceiling now. So it was a little bit of this, I guess.
This is very interesting to hear this is very interesting to hear about the very idea of mischief being embedded into a game, right? I do remember when I was playing your other game, that is I think the game which had to do with telephones, right? In the pause between the ringing, right? There was this one room I remember, as I kept picking up the telephones and then wandering from room to room. I think there was this one room where some sort of a glitch happened, probably due to my device, which is pretty slow. But for some reason, I suddenly found myself outside that room. I mean, outside the building itself. So I was simply standing. Simply found myself standing on a ledge, looking outside to a white expanse. And there was certainly a huge moment of vertigo. Like, where did I come? I suddenly started thinking, did I break the game? What happened to me? Where had I come? Where I had arrived? Did I come out of the game? And that moment of vertigo was very informative for me as such, because I did find myself back into the building, into the rooms as such. But then I keep looking at these little blinks of little glimpses of the white expanse between the doors, or between the window panes, or between the wood panels of the building. And I kept thinking that here in this particular building is this narrative being constructed. And even then, in that particular game, you continuously have us go from space to space, right? When one picks up a telephone and then suddenly there's a surreal space one has to navigate in order to go and pick up another telephone. So I think after playing the museum, in the pause between the ringing was a very strange change for me to sort of move between the spaces like this. But at the same time, I was also very much interested by by this alternative story that you weaved about the invention of telephones in colonial India. So that also told us a bit about the very way in which science and technology sort of had a very different role to play in the governance of colonial India. So I kept wondering, can you please tell us about the thought that might have went into this game, because it has so much to do with technology and governance in colonial India.
Yeah, so both the games actually, museum, and so there were a couple of projects that happened in between, but there was an interesting sort of through line connecting both the games together. So the museum was for a museum space in Cardiff, and we really liked the idea of putting a museum inside a museum, especially a museum that is to a certain degree making fun of the museum that the game is then displayed inside. So that is what we had sort of tried to do with the museum, and again with pause between the ringing, we were asked to do something very similar, but this time in a very strange series of events, we were asked to display the game right alongside, or pretty close to, actual colonial hoard, actual material artifacts that traveled from India to London, and we were wondering how best to think about it, to think about this movement of both bodies and language across what we imagine to be borders, both geographical but also political. And we started thinking about the idea of the telephone, and then of course we sort of appropriated William O'Shaughnessy's actual life and person into our story for our own purposes. because we found him to be a very interesting and somewhat uncomfortable character, trying to assimilate these two realities between what he found, in a country that he clearly seems to love or enjoy to a certain degree, and also what he manifested there. His telegraph project inevitably created the sort of architecture for British troop movement to dampen the force of the revolt in heaven. But he also wrote, this wonderful paper about medicinal uses of cannabis, and he, created best intravenous cure for cholera and worked as an assayer for the mint. So you have this very interesting character who embodied all these weird contradictions of a colonist in the country, which we. And we didn't want to tell Shaughnessy's story. We just wanted to use his story to demonstrate some of these contradictions. And the telephone simply became a very handy symbol to do so. The whole idea of mining the telephone and all the procedure surrounding the mining of the telephone and its lingual constraints and the violence that it inevitably leads to, and the whole technological arc to the story, indigenous versus colonial appropriation of indigenous resource and technology was something that the story accidentally stumbled into. It wasn't, wasn't the primary force behind writing the story, but we were very happy that it sort of ended up in that space, I guess.
Right, and that's very interesting. And there is also something else, somebody else probably who I wanted to ask you about, and that is this particular elusive character through which you seem to tell your stories. That is Mirumar Hassan, right? For us growing up in Bengal, we often grew up reading up stories, you can think of them as tall tales, where usually you would have this character who is an incorrigible person who continues telling stories which everybody knows are lies, but which everybody just can't get enough of. So we have this character called Konada who simply sits in his attic, and then he tells the stories about him going all around on adventures on the world and about everything, which sort of comes up from the Bengali tradition of Adda, that people know everything under the sun. So and that's a very interesting way which I've always found to look at a particular story. And Mirumar Hassan, while I was playing the games, the very aspect of the very specter, if one can think of Mirumar Hassan as a specter, comes out as somebody who is sort of like this, who is very unstable. While at the same time, as a student of literature, I found that character extremely interesting as a person to weave the stories through. So can you please tell us a bit about how you first came to think about Mirumar Hassan, and how in the course of the games that you have made, Mirumar Hassan has evolved, changed, stabilized or unstabilized as a character?
Yeah, so Mirumar Hassan started out as an excuse, if you will, a kind of format that we were using to create a little bit of room or distance between the histories that we were adapting or talking about and their final manifestation in game form. And we already had all these characters intervening in between, so at that time, I wasn't working on Under a Porcelain Sun, a game we've been working on for a while, but there was some idea that somewhere, and the idea of Kayamgarh, mythical city, exists, and sort of it's a city of storytellers, and and all these other emulsions in middle to early 1800s happen in and around it, and it was even then a story about forgers and forgeries and fake documents and fake histories being written, all of it mediated through the writings of Henry Conington and and Aziz and a bunch of other characters that we had sort of created back then. But more than the telling of that particular story, which was vaguely interesting but not particularly clever, what we found very fascinating was the idea of adapting, works like this. So we ended up creating fictitious character who is then telling all these words. And suddenly that conceit gave us a little bit more room to maneuver. And we also realized something very exciting started to happen the moment we withdrew the onus of authorship from ourselves and started to deposit it across multiple sources, or dubious sources rather, throughout history. The concern started to shift from where these stories emerge from and why they are being told, to what these stories meant and why are they being told now or in this particular context. And then it became very easy to inveigle, modern political commentary if necessary, or and then mix it sort of with historic events, and archaic lore, and and bizarre characters that we can bring in and out, as long as we created enough room between ourselves and Umar Hassan and the eventual of the story to fit all of this in. So that is sort of how it started. But then Umar Hassan started to become a more, he started out as a Anto clone of sorts, right? Working in Bombay, disillusioned by working in a newspaper called Malwa Chronicle, eventually writing in and around the time of the partition. That was the loose template that we were working with. But over a period of time, he started to calcify the character, particularly driven by ideas that get generated when Maharashtra and Gujarat was split, in '61, and when in our fictitious sort of law, the town of Matsyapur disappeared for some reason. It is evacuated and it vanishes from the face of the planet. And Umar Hassan then spends a lifetime trying to reconstruct it. And his incomplete works are a result of him attempting to and utterly failing to reconstruct the idea of Matsyapur. And this sort of modern day city mirroring the fate of Kayamgarh, from colonial times, suddenly gave us two polar sort of nodes around which we could start writing stories, often not mentioning the entirety of the lore or even dealing with it, just having Umar Hassan exist at certain points in history, or remark upon certain points in history, became a very convenient shorthand to delegitimize the stories that we were interested in telling or retelling or appropriating to a certain extent. So so over a period of time and over a period of games, I think Umar Hassan has to a certain degree calcified it. He's become subject to Dangi agitations and certain local political movements in and around the Dharampur region. He has become complicit in the fall of Matsyapur and the political conversations around statehood and territories. Post-independence, when Gujarat and Maharashtra split. So he's definitely become a more articulate person in his own right, I suppose. Really enough.
So you told about Matsyapur, and because I had this, when I'm playing games, I look at what I doing in gameplay terms that actually lends to the narrative. So one thing I found very interesting, that in the indifferent wonder of an edible place, when we are instructed to eat the things, we aren't eating for the pleasure of eating. There is some, at least I felt that there is a removed disconnect from the pleasure of eating for as a pleasure thing. Rather, it's a routine. Yeah. It's a routine that these are the numbers, the numbered place that you're going to eat and thing, and it's sort of, lends in for me, it lends into the narrative experience of drawing a clear distinction by removing the chaos and trying to bring so order into the everything. So what was your perspective on this? Or maybe I'm just reading nothing. I'm just, it wasn't even intended like that.
No, I think you read it quite accurately there. So the whole process was supposed to be tedious, right? So the idea that you can eat buildings in a game sounds fantastical to begin with. Mm-hmm. And the first time maybe you eat a block, you spend some time mucking around with the not their interface. There is a small degree of satisfaction. I finally ate a block, and the sound effects were weird and it looked interesting. And the second time you want to do it again, at most, right? After that, it becomes a tedious chore to have to keep doing it again and again and again, especially because the movement speed is particularly slow. Numbers flicker on the screen and you have to find that block. and I mean, it's still a game. It's still a relatively, it's meant as a exhibit, it's still relatively short. So quite a few things are very, very easy. Ideally, I would have wanted to make it, and at some point I'd probably revisit it, but wanted to make it even more tedious. So it feels like a chore having to eat the block over and over and again until, as you rightly point out, the pleasure seeps out of that exercise completely, and the labor of having to eat that block becomes very stark. So that even as you are, contemplating eating a block and actually eating a block, or thinking about is the weight of the narrative context within which you are eating the block, or you're simply bored by it, and you refuse to eat the block, which would also be an appropriate response to the game, I suppose. But in either case, I think you're quite right. It was meant to be a very tedious activity. So it's nice to see some of that tedium seeps through.
Yeah, nice. So I also had an interesting thing to know that you certainly told that you were inspired from the Dadaists and the situationalists. So I mean, is it Dadaism, Dadaist aesthetic? That is what you are trying to do through your overall art style of juxtapositions and. Yeah, or there are some other inspirations too behind the the visuals of your games, which are quite distinct.
Well, I won't call them Dadaists per se. I think the sort of style born out of a particular kind of Dadaism, and prior to that, a particular kind of surrealism, had a very specific iconography that it was responding to, and had very specific ways of wording it, and then challenging the idea of oil painting and perspective as a canvas that you would view and possess, and landscape in very specific ways. We don't yet have the vocabulary to do in our work. We're simply not that good at making video games, nor have we access to understanding video games that is that comprehensive. So our style tends to be closer to pastiche than to genuine attempts at surrealism, to be honest. But there is a certain base instinct that goes into selecting objects and subverting the scale and using industrial motives and objects and
Yes.
artifacts scattered about the landscape, so that we escape having to represent somebody's landscape and somebody's architecture that we do not completely possess and do not completely possess an understanding of, while still creating enough of a game world for people to exist within. So from decorations to motifs to comprehensible artifacts, like doors and drawers and things that you can interact with, or furniture. There's a lot that gets pulled in from, rather anachronistically pulled in from 1960s to 1980s, that period back to 1800s. But then we sort of, and of course, the intention is also to alienate the player to a certain degree by the very first, when they for the very first time encounter the video game landscape, so that they do not ever feel like they completely belong there. They're only passing visitors to the experience, and the experience itself shuns or rejects them because they cannot quite comprehend what it came about.
Interesting.
Right. This is extremely interesting. And Dhruv, I also wanted to ask you about something since we are talking about gameplay. I do remember, I think, attending a talk by you the previous month, yes, in December 2020, where you were exhibiting some of your games, some of your new games, and I think you received the question regarding gameplay. I think when somebody asked you about how much user intensive your games are, and I do remember you gave a very fascinating reply when you said that these games do not behave as we have expected games to continue behaving. So I was very fascinated by the fact that we have gotten into certain habits of expecting games to behave in certain ways, and the fact that your games behave in certainly different ways
Yeah.
sort of unsettles our very idea of what gameplay might or might not mean. So I just wanted to ask about if you could sort of elaborate on this perspective you had regarding a sort of a different behavior that we have to now sort of understand as an alternative space for gaming.
Yeah. So, I would probably posit it the other way around, where I think we have gotten used to a very niche and limited form of interacting with games. So games are, legacy systems. Most games build on video games that come prior to it, and there is a learned knowledge and behavior that you carry from one game into the other, and so on. Skill, if you will. Just familiarity with tropes and how you navigate games and negotiate them, and that is quite understandable. But if you look at board games, German-style board games in particular, they have subverted this expectation in very clever ways. So you might learn how to play Dominion, for example, but that hard. I mean, even though that familiarizes you with the idea of deck building, it is very cleverly subverted, at least mechanically, in early on. And because you are now gathering tiles and not mere cards, and they have fundamentally different functions. So there are laborious skills that you learn over a period of time, playing these board games, but that are allowed to breathe and evolve in clever ways, which video games try to do occasionally, and are reasonably successful at a purely mechanical level, but seem to fail to do when you think of it as a composite experience, and if you break down most video games, what you end up with are very, very simple interactions, which are simply cobbled together to create the illusion of complexity and consequence. And there are no other game systems that extend beyond these very simple interactions, and they sort of combine or recombine together, unless you're talking about very specific and very, very niche genres of games, or a whole host of very exciting indie games. So within that space, we were always very skeptical of essentially mounting on sort of understood or incompletely documented.
We sort of lost you for a while there, Dhruv.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, if you could just repeat a bit of what you said for the last 1 minute, I think.
Oh, yeah. Sure. No, so I was simply saying that even though video games are legacy systems, I don't think many games are very good at interrogating what individual mechanics mean to them, and what do they mean to the game world and their ability to tell stories and so on. And when smaller experimental projects can isolate these mechanics, just one action or two actions or a set of actions, dependent or otherwise, into the entirety of the game, they become a little bit more meaningful, at least, that is how I read them. So, for example, have you played They Came from a Communist Planet by Colestan? I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. It's a tiny little game where you go rioting around in the streets, and the streets are these very narrow passageways, you're throwing bricks and bottles, but the basic action or movement in the game is very simple. It's first-person movement combined with the act of throwing something, and that is it. But there's a degree of profound and hilarious anti-capitalist rhetoric that the game sort of folds into those actions, that make those actions magnificent to perform and truly joyous, each time you perform them within the game. And I think with a lot of games, we're trying to do that, or at least learning to do that, where we take very, very few forms of interaction and play agency, and we try and limit them as far as we possibly can, and can get away with, I guess, and then see if the one single interaction or two single interactions that we allow the players to perform, are they adding meaning to the process of negotiating the stories that are within the game.
Right. So this is extremely interesting to sort of hear about a very alternative forms of gameplay. And what sort of alternative narrative forms would you say inspires this sort of a different sort of a gameplay?
So I mean, video games have traditionally been very good at telling very, very limited set of stories, and for the most part, the most exciting encounters, even within these stories, tend to remain on the fringes of most video games. So if you think of a narratively coherent, or at least a reasonably narratively coherent game, which is well produced, and where people have sort of thrown tremendous amounts of effort into producing a game like that, say Witcher 3, for example, you are you're still locked into a very specific kind of sort of hero's journey narrative, and you're still locked into a very specific hierarchy of leveling up along with the game, and fighting a certain amount of monsters, causing a certain amount of mayhem for the game to start to yield any meaningful encounters, and the most interesting parts of the game often tend to be on the fringes of the main quest, where both the players are given a little bit more room to negotiate the stories as they want to, but also you can sort of see the designers having fun with the tropes that they're to subvert. And Andrei Sapkowski's works were meant to subvert a certain kind of fantasy, high fantasy writing, and then the Witcher game, which reappropriates Sapkowski's works rather violently by killing and reanimating the Witcher, do add this one additional layer of subversion on top of an already impressive piece of writing. So as a cultural artifact, that becomes very interesting. But how much of all that narrative entanglement is because of the way the game is written is not quite clear. The game can be played entirely on its own merits without ever being aware of the Witcher book series that came before it, or all the fiction fantasy writing that came before that the Witcher is trying to subvert, and so on. And the moment you start to remove all the meta narrative from Witcher, I think it becomes a much lesser experience. At least I find it to be a more tedious, rote form of storytelling. But imagine if you had the space that Witcher has, but you were allowed to play, for small bursts of time, as all the interesting and remarkably colorful characters that populate the world, who are not Witcher, and who are not as taciturn and as blank as Geralt is, and suddenly you have a significantly more exciting, tapestry of stories, which might not coherently be one game. It could be just a odd connection stories told in that space or in that world. But I think they have a better shot at animating all the intricate political intrigues and individual machinations that the characters seem to be going through, rather than have Geralt intervene in often truly absurd capacities to try and make sense of the expanse of the world.
Interesting. So what are your plans next? I've already seen the teaser for Under the Porcelain Sun, and it follows, I guess, the same narrative beats and threads of previous summer series. So I was thinking that, do you have any plans of exploring some other kind of visual style or narrative experimentation, or you're going to evolve on this formula only? So what are your plans?
So there are a couple of game projects that we are working on at the moment. Under a Porcelain Sun is definitely one of the primary ones. It's also a much larger game than anything we've built for. I mean, it's very small compared to most games, but it's still not the 15-20 minute experience that you have with our other work. This is about 2 hours, and it is it has a beautiful, very very rich soundtrack that we've been working on with a composer for a very long time, and we hope at least the spaces are a little bit more evocative, and the sense of a landscape is a little bit more grandiose, because it is told across a journey, however ludicrous the journey might be. So Under Porcelain Sun is definitely a game that I'm quite looking forward to, though we are slowly chipping away at it. We're also working on a very very small project. It's actually on display at the moment at Shenzhen, but it's a game about detentions and confinements, and of course about imprisonments, and often seem to be unjust imprisonments of dissenters in our country. It's called The Other Symmetries of an Absence, and it talks about longing and grief, perhaps a little bit of hope. It's a very very tiny little game, so planning to release it maybe early next month, something like that, as soon as the physical exhibit ends. And there's a game that we've just begun working on. It's a game set during the partition, though it's not so much a partition story as as the story of this one person living in a palatial house somewhere near Karachi, and it inveigles a little bit of my own family's journey from Karachi to a refugee camp outside Ahmedabad during partition, and tries to tell that story a little bit.
So you were talking about imprisonments, and you have already done work on the colonial perspective, how it's has evolved, and what are the facets that we experience now. So these are the themes which I have seen in you. So as I said, it sort of ties to the previous question that going forward, the projects you're thinking about, you must have always thought about some kind of themes. So are these themes different, or are there some themes you want to work on which you haven't, or you have already worked on the themes and you're now going to work on those themes only? So
I won't call them themes as such, more questions or concerns, that we want to spend some time thinking about or examining. So we have for a long time been interested in the idea of territories, right? But also the idea of belonging to a territory, and we want to, especially this with a sort of game set during the partition, but other works as well. We want to think about what it means to be a citizen. How do you view a state as a citizen, and how does the state view you as a citizen, and what privileges does becoming a citizen confer upon a body, and what violences are perpetrated upon bodies by the mere act of becoming or trying to become a citizen, and what is the violence that ensues the moment some degree of that implicit contract is breached, as you cross a border, a territory, enter into a new contract, another country to become another kind of a citizen, or when you cease to be a citizen as the state tries to define you as one. Some of our previous work has touched upon it, but we have never had a chance to delve into it with any degree of seriousness. So I think that's something that we are really looking forward to doing with subsequent work, especially in the context of of political convulsions in our own country, and the bizarre neo-colonial government that we seem to have ended up with.
Right, that's extremely fascinating, Dhruv, and I am afraid that we have probably come to the end of our podcast, because I think we have exhausted whatever time Zoom might have given us. So that was such a lovely discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dhruv.
Thank you for having me.
I dare say our listeners are going to be overjoyed with us finally being able to have that elusive talk with Studio Oleomingus that we've always been promising them ever since we had talks on your games. So this has been such an informative session, and you have given us a lot to think about gaming and alternative narrative forms that are more egalitarian and more promising in their plurality. We look forward to many more such lovely, fascinating games from Studio Oleomingus. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Both for having me.
Yes. Thank you so much. So we end on this note then. Okay. Bye.
Bye.